The bill came pasted to the shop shutter, with a great gout of common paste still wet at its corner, and Honora Wren had read the whole of it through twice by the thin grey window light before she would let herself understand that it was the end of them. It hung crooked over the small brass plate that still said E. Wren, limner. And under the auctioneer's flourishes it said one short thing, that the whole of the Wren studio, the house, the shop, the very brushes and the stacked canvases turned face to the wall, would be sold up within the month for the debts upon the estate, and that Miss Wren might apply to her guardian Mr. Silas Craik to learn what was to become of her. Honora was 24, and had kept the books of that shop and done the finer half of its work since she was 17, and she knew there was no answering it, and she stood a long while with her paint-stained thumb against the cold glass, looking at her father's name going grey under the weather, and did not weep. For she had learned long ago that weeping spoiled the light and mended nothing. She had known for a fortnight that it would fall, when it came to her, for there was no one else it could fall to. Her mother she scarcely remembered, having lost her very young. Her father, Odious Wren, the finest taker of likenesses in 3 counties, had been gone these 3 winters. Believing his life's work forgotten, her cousin Prudence, who kept house with her, was but 19, gentle and honest, with a good young curate half promised to her, whose family would drop her the day her name was soiled, and old Meg, who had nursed them both and was near blind now, could do nothing but fret by the grate. So it fell, as everything in that house had always fallen, to the plain one, the quiet one, who did the fine work and kept the books, and was thanked for neither. For that was the truth of the Wren studio, and only Honora and her father had ever quite known it, that a good half of the celebrated likenesses, which went out under the name of E. Wren, were not, and had not for years been, taken by the hand the buyer supposed. Old Elias had set his younger daughter at the drawing-board, almost before she could hold the chalk, and taught her the whole of the mystery, the reading of a face, the catching of the one true half-second, before a sitter arranged himself into what he wished to be, until in his failing years it was Honora's hand behind half the work that left the shop, and her name on none of it. A woman could not set up as a limner, the trade would not have it, and the sitters would not have it, so the work went out under her father's name, and Honora kept the secret as she kept the books, because the family lived on it, and because she had learned young that the surest way to be left in peace is to be reckoned of no particular account. Her guardian came that same evening. Mr. Silas Craik was her mother's sister's husband, a smooth, heavy, genteel man in the wine trade, who had contrived, in the 3 winters since Odious Wren was gone, to be made executor and guardian both, and to speculate the whole of the Wren portions quietly into the ground, with such a show of doleful kindness, that half the parish thought him a saint for the burden of his poor connections. He sat himself in her father's chair, by her father's fire, and told her, over the tea she had not offered but poured, that he had found the way to save them. "A girl in your place cannot be nice, Honora," he said, warming his rings. "Mr. Gadsby is a warm man, and the whole of what stands against this estate is owed to him, and he has taken it into his head, being a widower and lonely, that he would cancel the debt entire for a quiet, useful, sensible wife who gives him no trouble. He is not young, nor handsome, but he is sound, and it is a great deal more than a plain girl with no portion and a name gone to smash could ever look to, and I have as good as promised him your answer by Lady Day." Honora looked at the fire a moment, and then at the man who had spent her father's name and her cousin's portion, and now proposed to spend her, and said, in the level voice so many had mistaken all her life for meekness, "I understand you, uncle. You shall have my answer very soon. I ask only whether Prudence's little portion, the 50 pounds my father set by for her wedding, in her own name, is safe, for that at least was hers and never the estate's." And she watched his eyes go, for the smallest part of a second, to the corner of the room before he said heartily that of course it was safe. Quite safe. What a question. And she knew by that half-second, as she knew most things, everything she needed to, that Prudence's £50 was gone the way of all the rest, that her guardian was a liar, and that she must be very clever indeed. It was 3 days after, in the market town of Harnford, where she went weekly to cut shades at a stall by the assembly rooms, for whatever the country people would give, that she first met the old Duchess, though she did not for some while know her for that. An upright, very old lady in plain but beautiful grey, with a face like a fine ruin and the shrewdest black eyes Honora had ever met, sat down on the customer's stool and said she would have her shade cut, and she sat very still while Honora cut it. Most people fidgeted their own likeness into a stranger's, but this one sat like a carved thing and watched the girl, and looked at the finished profile a long moment, and said, "You have made me neither younger nor grander than I am, and caught the thing about my mouth my own people are too fond of me to see. That is rare, and not a comfortable gift, and I think you have paid for it. What is your name?" And when Honora told her, the black eyes went sharp and still. "Wren, you would be Elias Wren's girl. I knew your father a little long ago. He took a likeness once, in this county. That was the truest thing of its kind I ever saw, and it cost him dear, though that is an old story, and not mine to tell in a market square. Sit a moment, and tell me how you come to be cutting shades for pennies with a hand like that." And Honora, who never told anyone anything, found herself telling this fierce old stranger a good deal, the bill on the shutter, the studio to be sold. Mr. Gadsby, who was warm and lonely, for the old lady listened without one word of pity, which was why she got the truth, Honora being able to bear anything sooner than pity. At the end she rose and looked down with a strange arrested expression, as though doing a sum whose answer surprised her. "I am obliged to you for my shade, Miss Wren, and more obliged for your sitting still under a hard question. You may hear from me. I make no promises, having learned not to, but you may hear from me." And she went out to a very plain carriage, with a very grand old crest half scratched from the door, and was gone. She heard from her, after a fashion, 8 days later, though the letter that came was to Mr. Silas Craik, and Honora learned its contents only because her guardian came to her in a state of such barely governed excitement that he could not keep them. A gentleman of the very first consideration, the Duke of Harwood, the great recluse himself, was, through his man of business, seeking a wife, a quiet, plain, sensible, portionless gentlewoman of good character and no expectations, who would accept a private settled establishment and ask no more, and the Duke's people, upon a recommendation Craik could not account for, had come to Miss Honora Wren. There would be a settlement, Craik said, moistening his lips, a very handsome settlement, paid to the guardian who had so carefully reared her, a settlement beside which poor Gadsby's warmth looked a farthing dip. "The Duke of Harwood," said Honora slowly. She had heard the name the whole of her life. It hung over the far wooded vale of Nethercote like the weather. "A warm, laughing young lord once, the best liked in the shire, and as good as promised to the greatest beauty in it. And then, some 14 winters gone, the terrible business. A duel," the county said. A savage, disgraceful duel the young lord had forced in some black quarrel of his own, and been marked across the face for his sins, and the beautiful Miss Vane, who could not wed a disfigured brawler with a scandal on him, had broken it off and married a marquis. And the young lord had shut up Harwood Hall from that day, turned even his own portrait to the wall, dismissed the county, and never since been seen beyond his own park wall, the silent Duke they called him now, and the bolder sort the Beast of Harwood. "The Duke," she said, "who cannot bear to be looked at, whom no one has seen in 14 years. "The Duke who will pay £400, down to the man who brings him a wife," said Craik with feeling, "and a girl who would look a gift horse of that size in the mouth is a girl I have wasted my kindness on. Gadsby will keep, a duke will not. You will write and accept, and prettily, and I will hear no missish nonsense about scars. For a scarred duke's wife dines off gold, and a warm merchant's wife off Delft. And that is the whole of the philosophy a plain girl needs." And he went away well pleased to reckon up his £400, and Honora sat late by the low fire, taking the whole strange business apart to find the shape of it, and coming at last to a single hard bright fact at the center, that of the two men now bargaining for her over her own head, it was the monster she would choose. But that she would not be chosen like a shade cut for pennies and handed across a stall, that if she was to be sold she would set the price herself, in her own coin and to the buyer's own face. She wrote, therefore, not the pretty accepting letter her guardian looked for, but a very short one, and she wrote it not to the lawyer but by a direction the old Duchess's card had given her, to the Duke of Harwood himself. It said that Miss Wren was sensible of the honor, and had no objection to a marriage of plain convenience honestly meant, having a very clear notion of her own of what such a thing was worth to a woman in her place, and what it was not, but that she was not in the habit of agreeing to a bargain she had not seen, and would not begin the most important one of her life so, and that if his Grace would receive her, she would come to Harwood herself, alone, and say to his face what she had to say, and hear from his own what he required, and they might strike their bargain like two reasonable people, or not at all. She did not tell Craik she had written it. The answer came within the week, in a strong, dark, close hand, with something held very tight in it, Miss Wren. You are the first person in 14 years to propose to come to this house of her own will, and very nearly the first to write to me as though I were a man, and not a rumor. Come, then, and welcome, and say what you have to say to my face, since you are not afraid of it. I will send the carriage to the Nethercote turn on Thursday. I warn you only that I am a poor host and a worse bargain than my money makes me look, and that most people who come here meaning to be brave find their courage at the park gate and go home. If yours holds, we shall suit better than you think." Harwood and Honora read it twice, and folded it small, and felt, under the fear, a strange steadying warmth, for it was the letter of a lonely and honest and unexpectedly dry-humored man, and not the letter of a beast at all. She went up onto the high-wooded ground the next Thursday, as the light was failing, along a road that climbed for miles between hanging winter oakwoods, until the trees fell back, and the great house of Harwood stood up out of the last of the daylight above its silent park. It was a vast, gray, shut-faced house, half its windows shuttered, no smoke but from 3 chimneys out of 40, no dog, no lamp, and the whole west front was close-shuttered and blind, as though the house had turned that whole side of its face away from the world, and meant to keep it turned. Honora looked up at the blind west front a long moment, this taker of faces come to the house of the man who had turned his own to the wall, and then she got down, cold and stiff and steady, and knocked. An old butler opened it, a stooped gray courteous man named Osgood, who looked at her plain cloak and single small box with a gentleness that had no hope in it, and made as if to say the house received no one, but she gave her name before he could, and something in it stopped him, and he took her in, not through any lit room, for there were none, but across a great cold stone hall where the ancestors hung dim under Holland, and down a long paneled passage where the shut doors of the west front stood one after another, all closed, all silent, and brought her at last to a plain warm door at the far end, a working room, and left her. It was a long, low book-lined study, with one good fire and one branch of candles. And standing at the window with his back half to the door and the marked side of his face turned away into the shadow was the Duke of Harwood. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, dark, perhaps 35, and even half-turned. Even in the shadow he kept about himself like a coat. He was plainly no monster, but a grave, spare, handsome man, holding himself very still, as a man does who has taught himself that stillness draws less notice. "You have come a long, cold way, Miss Wren," he said without turning, in a low, rough, quiet voice, "up a drive most people cannot manage, to make a bargain you might have made by post, and spared yourself the sight of me. I will hear you, but I warn you I am out of the habit of being looked at, and I will not pretend the first few minutes are easy, for either of us. Say what you came to say, and do not mind me if I keep to the window." "I came to say it to your face, your grace," said Honora, "and I find I cannot say it to your shoulder blade, which tells me nothing I can bargain with. I make the half of my living reading faces, and the other half cutting them. I have taken the likeness of every kind of man there is, the vain and the frightened and the cruel and the merely tired, and I have never yet met the face I could not look at. Turn round, if you please, and let me see the man I am to marry, for sense cannot be talked in the dark." There was a silence so long she thought she had lost. And then the Duke of Harwood turned round, slowly, and set the marked side of his grave dark face full to the candle light and full to her, with the braced flat stillness of a man who had done this before and watched a face change, and Honora, raised on the tail of the beast and schooled the whole cold way to give away nothing, looked at the long old healed seam that ran pale from the edge of his left brow down along the cheekbone, an old scar, well healed, faded to the color of a scar many winters gone. A thin, quiet line on a face otherwise only grave and tired and watchful, and did the one thing no one at that turning had done in 14 years. She looked at it plainly, the ordinary moment one rests on any new face, and did not flinch, nor soften into pity, nor by so much as a flicker pretend it was not there. She looked at him as she would look at any face she meant to know, and went on. "There, now I have seen it, and you have let me, and we need neither of us waste another minute on it, for it is the least interesting thing about your face by a long way, and I speak as one paid to know which thing in a face is the interesting one. It is an old scar, well healed, and I have seen plainer men wear worse and think nothing of it. Now here is my offer, and it is a better bargain than your lawyer has been buying, for your lawyer has been buying a plain, useful wife who will ask nothing, and I am something rather more useful, and I will tell you honestly what I am. I am 24, plain, portionless, and the true hand behind a great many likenesses that went to market under a better-known name than mine, which has taught me what it is to do the real work and let another take the credit. I keep house and books better than any steward. I do not want your love, and I do not want your company, and I will not trouble your solitude 1 hour more than you wish. You want a wife by some term I do not yet understand, or your lawyer would not be so pressed. I want a roof that is not Mr. Gadsby's, and a way to keep my cousin off the same auction block I stand on. You have a monster's name you have not earned, I think, and I have a plain woman's invisibility I have earned very hard, and I believe we might do each other a great deal of good and no harm at all. What is your term, and what do you require of me?" The Duke had gone very still, and something moved far back in the grave dark face that she had no name for then, though the name came later, and it was astonishment. "You are either the coldest woman I ever had the misfortune to receive," he said at last, "or you are playing at cold at very great cost to yourself, because you have people at home who will go to the wall if you fail. And I have taken enough true likenesses in my own time to think it the second. Sit down, Miss Wren, you are shaking, though you would sooner perish than own it. Name your own terms first. I would rather hear what a woman wants for herself than what she thinks I want. It is a far more honest way to begin, and we seem, unaccountably, to be beginning honestly. Then I will name them. said Honora, sitting, because in truth the room had begun to swim, and there are three, and I will not sign a word without all three. The first is for my cousin. Prudence is 19 and honest, and has a good young man who will have her if her name is clean, and drop her the hour it is not. So her little portion, the 50 pounds my father set by, for her in her own name, which my guardian has spent, though he will swear on his soul it is safe, is to be made good and settled on her the day I sign, to her sole separate use, out of the reach of Mr. Silas Crake and every creditor of his living or to come. She is not to be sold, as I am being sold. I will spend myself, but I will not have her spent. The second is for two old people who have nothing. My nurse Meg, who is near blind and has loved us for nothing all her life, is to have a warm corner and a sure small keep to the end of her days, wherever I am. And the third, said Honora, and her voice changed a little and grew steady, the third is for me, and it is the only thing in this whole bargain I want for myself, and not for another. My father was Honora Wren. You will not have heard the name. He was the finest limner in the county, and made no fortune by it. And he was gone 3 winters ago, believing his life's work forgotten. With his last picture unfinished on the easel, a likeness of my mother, from memory and an old sketch, that he never had the heart to finish, and I never had the heart to sell. It is to be seized within the month and sold with the stock, and God knows what a sale room does with a half-made picture of a woman nobody can name. That is my third term. Before I sign, my father's own tools, his brushes and colors and boards and portfolios entire, and that one unfinished canvas are to be bought in from the auctioneer, unbroken and brought here with me. Keep your title and your gold, I ask for neither. I will have my father's tools, and I will finish his last picture myself, though it take me years, and no other hand shall touch it. The Duke had gone very still again, in a different way. You will finish it yourself, he said. It was not a question. It was too large for one. I will. I did the finer half of his work for years, though the world will never let it be said, and I am the only creature living who knows how my father saw my mother's face, for he told me, at the last, when he could no longer hold the brush. She lifted her chin. Most men think a woman who says such a thing mad or lying, and I have long since given over minding which they pick. But you asked my terms, and that is the one I care for, and I will not sign without it. For a moment the tall man by the window did not move. Then he crossed the room, and stood over the great desk, and looked down at something upon it beside the standish. Honora had taken it for a paper waiting the blotter, and she saw now that it was a small worn morocco case, closed, and he touched it once, lightly, the way a man touches an old hurt to learn whether it still aches, and did not open it, and looked up. In 14 years, Miss Wren, no one has come into this house and asked me for anything at all, because the whole world holds it settled that there is nothing here any sane creature could want. And you have come up my drive with your entire life in wreck behind you, and asked me for a box of old brushes and a picture no one can sell. I grant you all 3 terms, gladly, and will trouble no lawyer to haggle a farthing of them. Your cousin's portion made good before the week is out, your old people kept warm, your father's tools and his unfinished picture brought here whole before the auctioneer's men lay a finger on them. And it is the first time in a very long while I have had it in my power to give a person the one thing she truly wanted, and find it cost me nothing but the doing. Go home and settle your household, and come back and be married as quietly as ever 2 people were. It is a bargain, Miss Wren, and I think, though I would not have believed it this morning, it may be a better one for me than for you. They were married 3 weeks after, in the small cold church at Nethercote, below the wooded hill, before almost nobody, old Osgood, the grave housekeeper Mrs. Gaunt, a frightened, weeping old parson who had christened the Duke and had plainly kept up the family habit of grieving over him ever since, and, in the shadow of a side pew, sharp-eyed and upright, the old Duchess of the market stall, whom Honora now understood at last, and to whom she gave one long look of comprehension across the aisle, and received one grim, satisfied nod in return. Honora wore her gray silk and no veil, and did not once look away from her husband's face, for she had resolved upon the single thing she had to give him that his gold could not buy, which was honesty. And when the Duke bent to sign the register, she saw that he wrote his name, Lucian, with the unmarked hand, and kept the other, the right, a little back and half closed, as a man keeps a thing he does not wish looked at, and she saw where his hand went in the moment before he signed, the small unthinking touch at the breast of his coat, and she knew, before ever she was told, that whatever the little worn case upon his desk had held, it went now next to him, and had gone so a long time, and was the truest thing about him. Harwood in the days that followed was the strangest house she had ever kept, and the most sorrowful, and not at all the neglected ruin the county supposed. It was a mourning house, and not a squalid one, the used rooms kept with a still exact grieving care, the fires laid and screened before she woke, the brass bright, as though a devoted household were keeping the whole place in hushed readiness for a life that had gone out of it, and might, if all were only kept just so, one day walk back in. And through the heart of it, sealing off half the great house, ran the blind west front, the staterooms shuttered, the long gallery locked, the whole beautiful public face of Harwood turned away and closed, exactly as the man had turned and closed his own. She found the shut west front the hardest thing in the place to bear. For a house that has closed its own best rooms against the light is a house holding its breath, and she had married a man who had held his for 14 years. But it was not only shut doors she found. On her first morning, waking in a warm, bright room she had not looked for she had expected to be housed like the useful furniture. And instead the fire had been lit and screened before she stirred, she saw a thing that stopped her breath. Along the whole north wall, where the painter's light falls coolest and truest, someone had set up a working studio, a good easel, a long deal table, a stool, and ranged upon the table in their proper order were her father's tools, every brush and blade and board and stump of chalk. His colors in their papers, his portfolios corded exactly as she had corded them the night before the sale, bought in entire, carried the 20 miles up the hill, and laid out ready before ever she came. And on the easel, its cloth turned gently back, stood her father's last unfinished picture, the half-made likeness of the mother she scarcely remembered, the face still only ghosted in. Waiting these 3 winters, and now, it seemed, waiting still for her. Honora stood in the doorway with her hand pressed hard over her mouth, and did not understand one word of what she saw, for it was one thing to grant a term, and quite another to have caused this made ready, north light and all, by someone who knew that a limner needs the true light, and not the flattering south. And she thought, who at Harwood could know that? She asked the housekeeper, a tall, spare iron gray woman of 60, named Mrs. Gaunt, with a ring of keys at her waist and a face long out of the practice of showing anything. The room was His Grace's order, Your Grace, said Mrs. Gaunt. He was particular it should have the north wall and the cool light, not the pretty south. He said the mistress would want the true light, and not the kind one, and would know the difference. He had it made ready with the late Mr. Wren's things, and stood in it himself the evening before you came, a good while looking at the picture on the easel, and said nothing, and went away. And when Honora, hardly trusting her voice, asked how the Duke should know a limner wants the north light, or stand looking at an unfinished picture of a woman he had never met, the gray face unbent by the width of a single sentence, I couldn't say what is in His Grace's mind. He does not tell it me. But I have kept this house 14 years, and I'll say this, having said too much, that man has not willingly stood in a room with a picture since the year of the trouble, but keeps the gallery locked and the pictures turned, and goes the long way round sooner than past them. And the first thing he did when he knew you were coming was send to Harnford for a gone man's brushes and set them out with his own hands in the truest light in the house. I don't know what it means, but I know it means something, for I never in 14 years saw him do the like. And she gathered her keys and went out, and left the new Duchess standing in the cool north light among her father's brushes, listening to her own heart, which she had told very firmly to behave itself, and which would not. She found the gallery on the 4th day. She had been given the run of the house, all of it, she was told, save the west gallery, which her husband had asked her, in a voice gone suddenly flat. To leave to him a little while, he would tell her why one day, and until then would she give him that, without his telling. And she had said yes, and meant it, for she had told him at the altar she would not pry. But on the 4th day, passing the long locked west passage, she found the great gallery door standing an inch ajar, and old Ambrose Pell within, the oldest soul at Harwood, a bent brown gentleman of near 70, who had been drawing master to the young lord long ago and gallery keeper ever since, and had never been turned off, though there had been no gallery open to keep for 14 years, but kept about the shut rooms with his soft cloths, dusting the turned faces of pictures no one was allowed to see. He looked at her a long moment with his old wet shrewd eyes, and said, "You'd be the one then. The old Duchess said there'd be one day that could be let in here. I'm too old to be sure I ought. But I'm too old, likewise, to think it does a wound any good to keep it locked in the dark 14 years. And you've a right, being his wife, that I haven't the right to keep from you. Come in, if you're coming. Only tread soft. This is the saddest room in England, and the truest, and it isn't what the county thinks." The long gallery ran the whole blind west front, high and cold and shuttered, a great avenue of dim ancestors all shrouded loosely in holland, so they hung like a double row of the patient forgotten. And old Pell went before her with his one candle to the very end her husband had asked her to leave him, where, alone of all that gallery, one great picture hung not in holland like the rest, but behind a drawn curtain of black stuff, and hung, moreover, with its face turned clean to the wall, so that only the blind back of the canvas showed to the room. "That's the one, your grace," said Pell, very low, and lifted his candle. "That's the one the whole county has a tale about, how the mad duke slashed his own likeness in a rage the year he was marked, or turned it to the wall for shame of his ruined face, and the great picture lost. There isn't a soul in the Vale under 50, but grew up on it. And there isn't a soul, save me, that knows the tale's a lie, for he never slashed it nor lost it. He turned it because he could not bear to be looked at by the man he was before, and curtained it so none should see and pity him, and he has kept it whole, and had me dust the back of it once a month, 14 years. Turn it, if you dare, your grace. You've more right than I. I never dared but once, and I put it back." Honora stood before the great blind canvas a long while. And then, because a thing turned to the wall was to her the one unbearable thing in any room, she drew back the black curtain and took the heavy frame in both her paint-knowing hands, lifted it from its hook, and turned it round to the candlelight. And she looked at what 14 years of a whole county's telling had called a slashed ruin and a monster's shame, and found instead the finest portrait she had ever seen, whole and unhurt, and glowing under the dust, a full length of a warm, laughing, dark young man of 22, in the dress of 14 winters gone, standing bare-headed and open-faced in the summer light of this very park, with a hound at his knee, his face unmarked, and full of a trust in things that made her throat close to look at, a young man set down by a hand that had plainly loved him, every line kept not to flatter, but to keep. And there, in the low corner, in the small firm signature she would have known blindfold at the bottom of the sea, in her own late father's hand, the two words, E. Wren, Pinset, and beneath them a year older than her cousin. She was still standing so, the great warm portrait in her arms, and the tears running down her plain face without her leave, when she heard behind her the small check of a step and a sharply drawn breath, and she turned, not troubling to hide her wet face, and saw her husband in the doorway of the room he had asked her to leave him, the gray light on the marked side of his face, gone quite white and still. "This is my father's picture," she said, and did not try to steady her voice. "His hand is in the corner. Odious Wren painted this. My father painted you." "Yes," said the Duke of Harwood. He did not come nearer, and did not turn away. "Your father painted me, in the last good summer of my life, the year I was to be married, when I was 22, and believed everything a young man believes. He was months at it, up here in the long light, the gentlest, least worldly man I ever knew. He did not paint me the way the great ones paint a duke's heir, all leg and lineage. He painted the boy that was actually there, because he said that was the only part worth keeping, the rest being tailoring. It is the truest thing ever made of me, and the last made before the rest of it came, and when I could not bear the sight of that boy's face, believing all he believed, I turned him to the wall. I did not slash him, whatever the county says. I could no more put a knife to your father's work than to my own heart, and I have kept it whole in the dark 14 years, and never once let myself look at it again." He stopped, and something in his rumored face was naked and unbearable. "I did not know whose daughter you were. When my people brought me the name Wren, I did not so much as think of this picture. The name had gone out of the world, and I had made myself forget the summer with everything else in it. It was only when you stood in my study and said your father's name aloud that I understood whose hand it was I had lived under, turned to the wall, these 14 years. And even then it seemed too strange and tender a thing to say to a woman I had that hour contracted to marry, that the last true likeness ever taken of me was made by your father, and that I have kept it honored and hidden at the shut end of my house longer than you have been grown." Honora looked from the warm, laughing-painted boy to the grave-marked living man and back, and something in her that had been braced since the bill went up on the shutter, braced her whole life if she were honest, came quietly loose, the way a knot gives when at last you find the right thread. "Then we have neither of us been quite so alone in this as we believed," she said. "My father's finest work, kept honored at both ends of the county by two people who never knew the other kept it. He was gone 3 winters ago, thinking his life come to nothing, thinking this very picture lost or slashed by a madman. For that tale came even to us, and it was one of the sorrows that broke him. And all that while his masterwork stood whole, and loved in the place of honor of a duke's house, turned to the wall by a man grieving the same lost thing my father grieved. I am glad I know it. And the Duke of Harwood, who knew no better than she what to do with a weeping woman, came a little way into the forbidden room, not touching her, and said the truest thing yet said in that marriage. I am glad you came, Honora. I did not think I should be glad of anything again. I find that I am glad of you." And then, as though the saying had cost him more than he could well afford, he bowed his dark head and went away down the long gallery and out. But he had said it, and they had both heard it, and that night, for the first time in 14 years, the curtain at the end of the gallery was left drawn back. She learned the man through the house, and it was old Pell who taught her most of the rest, in slow, sidelong installments. Wherever she came on him, dusting the patient faces, for she went to the gallery daily now, and had begun to bring the shut room back to life, turning one veiled ancestor and then another to face the room, letting the true north light in upon mordaunt faces that had stared 200 years at nothing. That his grace had been the warmest, best-liked young lord the shire had known, Pell told her, kind to the servants and tenants, forever drawing them in the margins of his copybooks, for the boy had a real gift, and old Pell had taught it him. That there had been a young lady, before here Pell grew careful, and rubbed at a frame that wanted no rubbing, Miss Cassandra Vane. The acknowledged beauty of the county, of a proud, overreached family, as good as promised to the young lord while he was whole and merry, who found, after the trouble, that she could not care for a marked face and an ugly story, and broke it off, and married the Marquis of Sotherton within the year. But it was not the losing of the beauty that had done the worst of it, Pell said, low, nor even the scar, which had healed clean inside the year. It was the thing underneath both, whatever had truly happened the night the young lord was marked, that the county had one loud tale of, and that old Pell believed with his whole soul to be a black lie. You'd have to have that from his grace's own mouth, your grace, or never have it true at all. I only know the boy I taught, and I know that boy no more forced a savage quarrel than he could fly, and I know he's worn the blame of the wrong story ever since like a shirt he'll not take off, and turned his own face to the wall along with his picture. Don't you let him carry it alone, when he comes to tell you. It's bent a straighter back than yours or mine would bear. The old Duchess thinks you're the turning of it, and she's a hard woman to fool. There were 2 places he had not turned back to the light, and she left them, for a while, to him. The first was the great portrait's own curtain, which, though drawn back now, he had not once in her seeing stood before by daylight. He would come to the gallery of an evening, and stand near it in the dark, and not look. The way he took the little worn case from over his heart, in a silence, and held it shut, and put it back unopened. And the second was a small shut room off the gallery's end, locked apart, and when Honora once laid her hand on its door, old Osgood said very gently at her shoulder, "Not that room, if you please, your grace." That is where his grace had the 2 letters, the one week, 14 years since, the lady's, and the other, and he has not had it opened since. And she took her hand away, and did not ask, for she had begun to understand that the shut room and the curtained picture and the closed case over his heart were all one wound looked at from 3 sides, and that behind all 3 stood a single night 14 winters gone, that the whole house had been holding its breath around ever since. I will give you the room, and the picture, and the little case, and I will not ask, she told him one evening in the study, for he had begun to come to dinner more often than not, and to sit after it by the one good fire, taking the great chair with his marked cheek turned by old habit from the candles, though she noticed he turned it less than he had. I give you all 3, and gladly, because you set my father's tools out in the true north light with your own hands before ever you knew whose they were. But I will tell you plainly, since we began honest, a thing turned to the wall in a house is a grief that everyone learns to walk the long way round and no one mends, and there is no face so marked, and no picture so sad, that it is better kept in the dark than brought to the light, and looked at true. When you are ready to turn the great picture back to the room by daylight, and tell me what happened the night that shut this house, I will be standing under it, looking and not flinching. He did not answer her that night, but he let her thaw the house by inches in the weeks after, because he could not quite bring himself to stop her. She turned the ancestors back one by one, and opened the west shutters a pane at a time, watching his face each time the true light fell into a room dark 14 years, and she took, to fill the long silences, the likenesses of the household, Osgood and Mrs. Gaunt who unbent for it, and Pell, and the shy scullery folk, and pinned them up in the servants' hall, so that Harwood, which had let no new face be made in it since the year of the trouble, began very softly to be a house where faces were caught and kept and looked at again. It was the little case over his heart she did not touch, for she understood at last that it was not the house, but the man, and the house only the sign of him. Once coming on him unawares in the study, she saw him take it out and open it, and saw that it was not a miniature of a woman, as she had half feared, but a small worn drawing on a scrap of paper, a few lines of chalk, a young man's face. And he shut it before she could see more, and she did not ask. But she knew now that whatever the folded chalk drawing was, it was the true wound, and the shut house only its shadow, and that a man might one day let his whole gallery back to the light and still carry his own worst hour folded next to his heart to the end of his days, if no one ever showed him he need not. She did not touch it. She waited. And one bright, hard evening, working late at her father's easel over the ghosted face she had begun to bring up out of the ground, she straightened and found her husband standing close behind her, come up without her hearing, looking not at the picture, but at her hands upon it, with an expression she had not seen before, naked and unguarded. The look of a man watching someone do the one thing he had believed could never be done again. Go on, finish a thing. Bring a face up out of the dark and let it be looked at. You are truly going to finish it, he said low, your father's last picture. You are going to make her face and hang it in the light. I am, said Honora, not turning quite round, for she had learned he told her the truest things when he was not being looked at. It was never spoiled, your grace. That is the thing people never understand about my father's pictures, and about a good many faces they give up on. It was only unfinished. There is all the difference in the world between a thing spoiled and a thing merely unfinished, or turned away, or waiting. The one you throw on the fire, and the other only wants the right hand and enough patience and a little courage, and it will come up as true as ever, and truer for the waiting. I have known that since I was 6 years old. It is very nearly the only thing I know. But I have come to think it worth the telling to people who have forgotten it, whatever their pictures are made of. And she felt, rather than saw, the marked right hand come up, slowly, as though unsure it was allowed, and it did not go to the case over his heart, for the first time in her seeing, but came to rest, bare and old scarred and light, upon her shoulder, and the Duke of Harwood said, in a voice she had not heard him use, Honora, only that, her name, by itself, as the whole of the sentence, and not the direction on the outside of it, and she stood very still, and did not turn, and went on with her father's picture, so that he need never think she had stopped her work for pity. It was at the tail of that first hard winter, near the anniversary of the old trouble, that the shut thing in the man broke open at last. And it was broken open, as such things often are, by the very sort of careless cruelty that had shut it. Honora had marked how her husband darkened as the short days drew on toward the season of the duel, coming less to the fire, riding out longer alone, sitting late with the little worn case upon the desk, and old Pell told her, lo, that it was always so. The black fortnight round, the night he was marked, and into that raw dark fortnight, unlooked for, came the Duke's cousin, Miss Neville Mordaunt, the man who would have had Harwood and all of it, had Lucian let the old Duke's term run out unmarried, and forfeited the estate into his cousin's smooth, greedy hands, come now to make what unpleasantness he could over the plain nobody of a wife who had cheated him of a dukedom by the simple expedient of existing. He was a florid, loud man who drove too fast, and he drove his high phaeton and 2 hot greys down into Nethercote on market morning, as though the village were already his. Honora was in the street that morning, and her cousin Prudence with her, for Prue her portion made safe, and her curate promised now, had come up for a fortnight's visit, and the Duke himself was there, which was the newest and most fragile thing of all, for he had that very week begun, at her quiet coaxing, to come down among his own people again. So they were all 3 in the street, when Neville's greys, overfresh and maddened by a snapping awning, took the bits in their teeth, and came down the crowded market in a bolting thunder of iron, the phaeton whipping behind, and Neville hauling uselessly and bawling, and in the road before them, frozen, stood an old apple woman of the village and her grown daughter, too stiff and too loyal to leap clear. What the county said afterward, when at last it came to say anything true about the Duke of Harwood, began with the next half-minute. The whole market saw it entire, saw the Beast of Harwood, the man who could not bear to be looked at, come off the edge of the crowd in a single headlong plunge and go straight at the heads of the bolting greys. Not away from the danger, as every sane soul was doing, but full into it, and get a hand to the near bridle, and be dragged the length of 3 stalls, hanging on, until his weight and his voice brought the maddened horses staggering round to a halt, not a yard from the 2 frozen women, and in the doing a swinging splinter of a broken stall pole took him across the face along the old marked side, and laid the pale seam open afresh, so that he stood in the market with his ruined, rumored face running fresh red, his own body still between the horses and the apple woman, while the whole village looked on. And the market fell into a silence, unlike any Honora had yet met in the vale. 200 country people watching the monster they had been reared on stand bleeding in the road, having gone into a thing not one of them had dared, for 2 poor women who were nothing to him, and understanding, altogether, that they had been telling the wrong tale about this man for as long as most of them had been alive. Neville Mordaunt met not one friendly eye, got his blown horses turned, and drove out of the vale that hour, and did not come back. She got him home, and would let no one else tend him, had him into the study by the good fire, the door shut, and washed the fresh cut clean by her own hands, the new hurt lying bright across the faded old one. And it was there, in the winter dark, with his marked cheek turned up under her careful hands, and the one lamp she would keep alight standing steady between them, that the Duke of Harwood told his wife the truth, for a man who has just gone bleeding into a runaway to save 2 strangers cannot, that same night, keep a locked door between himself and the wife, dressing the wound. "You have wondered about the duel," he said in a flat, low voice, "and the shut room, and the picture turned to the wall. The county says I got this face in a wickedness of my own, drunk or jealous, one winter night 14 years ago, forcing a black quarrel on a better man, and justly marked for it. It is a lie from the first word to the last. There was a duel. I never denied it. I only ever denied nothing, and let the county build what it pleased on my silence. But the cause of it was not mine. There was a great house party that winter, the season I was to be married, and among the company, of no consequence to anyone, a young gentlewoman named Miss Alice Ford, a poor clergyman's daughter earning her bread as companion to a cross old lady, invisible to everybody. And late one night, the men deep in wine, Cassandra's brother, Sir Roderick Vane, a coarse and powerful man, took it into his head to amuse himself with her in a passage off the hall, and had her cornered and frightened past crying out, and the half-dozen men who saw were laughing or looking at their boots, because Roderick Vane was too rich to cross over a nobody with no one in the world to speak for her. And I was the only man in that passage not afraid of him. So I put myself between them, and made him let her go, and saw her safe away, and because I had shamed him before witnesses, he called it insult and demanded satisfaction, so the true story should drown in the noise of a duel. And I met him at dawn, because there was no honest way not to." "And you were marked," said Honora, very low, holding the cloth still against the cut. "I was the better blade," he said, "which is the part the county could never be allowed to know, for it undoes their whole tale. I could have run him through in the first half-minute. And I did not, for I have never seen the use of ruining a man past mending when disarming him will serve. So I turned his blade, and took the hilt from his hand, and had my point at his throat, and let him up, and in the turning his point came across my brow and cheek, here. And that is the whole of how I came by my face, not in a savagery of my own, but in sparing the man who earned the quarrel. defending a woman the whole room had abandoned. And when they asked the cause, I would not say. I would not name Alice Ford. To speak the cause was to publish her shame and finish the one blameless life I had spent my own face to save. So I held my tongue, and let the county make of my silence what it liked. And what it liked, being led carefully by the veins, was that I was the drunken aggressor, and rightly served. He turned the marked side of his face up to the lamp then, and said the last of it, and it was not the scar he spoke of, and Cassandra believed them. That is the wound, Honora, not this face, for this healed inside the year. The woman I loved and had thought loved me heard the ugly tale, and looked at my marked face, and did not once come and ask me was it true. She did not ask. She took the story that was least trouble to herself, and gave me back my ring and married Southerton in the spring. He drew the little worn case from over his heart, opened it, and held it out on his open, scarred palm at last, a small drawing on a scrap of paper, a few lines of chalk, a warm, laughing, dark young man of 22, her father's own first study for the great portrait. I learned that night, the thing I have never since unlearned, that I was a man who could be loved as a picture and not born as a man. The county, and Cassandra with them, had loved the smooth gilded air with the unmarked face, from across a room, at a flattering distance, for his surface, and the moment I was truly seen, close to, the marked man who had done the one wholly right and costly thing of his life, the very woman who claimed to love me, turned her face away, and did not even ask. So I understood that to be looked at truly, all of me, by someone who then turns away, is the one thing I cannot live through twice. And I made myself safe from it the only way I could see. I turned the boy's picture to the wall, and myself along with him, and became the thing they had decided I was. For a picture turned to the wall cannot be looked at and left. It can only be left. That is the man you married to save your cousin, not a beast, but a coward of exactly one kind. And I carry the boy your father drew next to my heart, not because I mourn the face I lost, but because that scrap of chalk is the only likeness in the world, taken by a hand that looked at me kindly and asked nothing back, the one place left where I had been truly seen and not left. You may know the whole of me now. You owe me nothing. The lamp stood steady between them, and Honora Wren sat with her husband's cut cheek under her hand, and the little chalk study open on his scarred palm, and found that the low lifelong certainty she had been reared inside, that she was the plain one, the useful one, worth exactly the work of her hands and no looking at more, had gone strangely quiet in her, and she took the little drawing up, very gently, looked at the warm young face her own father's hand had made, and then at the marked living one before her, and closed the case, and gave it back, and kept her hand over his upon it. I am going to tell you what you owe me, Lucian, and what you do not, since we are being exact, she said, and her voice did not rise. It had not risen once in the whole of this, and she did not mean to begin now. You do not owe me a marriage of pity, and I would not take one. There is no pity in me for you and never was. Only a great and growing respect, which is a far more dangerous thing. But the wound you think has put you past any woman staying, the belief that you can be loved as a picture and not born as a man, that is the one untrue thing in this room, and it is a false likeness, and I am the one creature alive, bred from the cradle, to catch a false likeness and set it right. The county took your likeness once, from an ugly tale told by people who never troubled to look at you at all, and a likeness taken so is always a lie, my dear, for the truth of a face is only ever caught up close, in poor light, by someone willing to sit with it a long time and not look away. I have taken 1,000 faces, and never once met a truer one than yours, nor one more falsely drawn by the world. You were not ruined, you were misdrawn. Cassandra Vane left you because her eye was poor and her heart small, And Roderick Vane lied, because his soul was poorer still, and those were their faults, and never once yours. And you have worn their poverty 14 years, as though it were your own deformity. I am taking it off you tonight, and I am going to take your true likeness, not the boy on the wall, but the man in this chair, the marked man, in the truest light I can find, and hang it in the gallery where the whole county may come, and look at you, and learn at last what you are. And I am going to turn the boy's picture back, to face the room, to keep him company, the whole face and the true one side by side, so that anyone who looks may see there was never a monster here. Because you were wrong, Lucian, a man turned to the wall is only truly alone. A man is safe, entirely safe, only when he is looked at, all of him, in the full light, by someone who has seen the whole and does not turn away. And I have seen the whole of you now, and I am not turning away, and there is no clause in it and no term, and it is full and final, and it cannot be reopened. Now be still, and let me finish your face. I will not have my husband bleeding. In the same winter, I have only just found out I had a husband worth the keeping. Everything after was different, and nothing changed on the face of it. They did not carry the truth of the duel to the county that spring. There was much in it their own to keep, and above all Alice Ford's name, which Lucian had spent his own face to guard, and would not now spend to clear himself, and in which Honora came without a word to agree. But the marriage was no longer a bargain on either side, and both knew it. And Honora began that very week the picture she had promised, set a fresh canvas on her father's easel in the true north light, and made her husband sit to her under his own turned-back boyhood, and looked at his marked living face as kindly as any hand ever had, and set it down true. She turned the great boyhood portrait back to face the room that spring, by daylight, with him standing under it at last and not flinching, the warm laughing 22 looking down at the grave, marked 35 he had become. The whole face and the true one under one roof and one light. And then, near a 12-month wed, at the turn of the following autumn, her own share of the reckoning came up the wooded hill after her, in the person of the man who had sold her. Mr. Silas Craik, having spent his £400 and found the ducal connection slower to enrich him than he had reckoned, came up the Nethercote Road one raw bright afternoon in a hired chaise, and with him, which Honora had looked for, a narrow smiling attorney named Mr. Dabney with a leather portfolio on his knee. Craik came into the great hall, reopened now, and warm, and hung with its ancestors turned back to the light, embraced his niece with a warmth that had never once been there, while she cut shades for pennies to keep his house, and settled by the fire, as one come home to his due. Honora received them with unimpeachable tea, under the great turned-back portrait, and beside her own new one of her husband, and she waited, for a Craik with a want in him always comes at last to the naming of it. Her husband stood by the hearth, silent, at her asking, for she had told him the night before what she meant to do, and he had argued, it being his whole nature to take a wrong upon himself sooner than let another be troubled by it, and she had said, no, my dear. You have spent 14 years wearing the ugly story, so no one else need be shamed by the true one. It is my turn now, and it is my guardian. Stand by the fire, and be silent, and let me show you what your gentleness has been for. And he bowed his dark head and did as she asked. Mr. Dabney opened, as such men open, with a full half-hour of smiling regret, the sad narrowness of Mr. Craik's circumstances, who had beggared himself in the rearing of his orphan connections, the singular liberality of the Duke's alliance, of which the family had understood they were to partake and had not, and, more delicately, the great pity it would be if the peculiar circumstances of so singular a marriage were ever to become a subject of common talk, or if the old stories of the Beast of Harwood were ever, by an aggrieved family, to be freshly and loudly told. Name the figure, Miss Dabney, said Honora pleasantly, You have been half an hour not naming it, and the tea is going cold. Come to the sum." And Dabney put off his stroke, named it a handsome annuity to Mr. Silas Craik, secured upon Harwood the discharge of certain fresh obligations, a suitable acknowledgment of a guardian's natural feelings. His natural feelings. "Yes, thank you, Miss Dabney, and I will now be equally plain, and then you shall both be in the chaise before the good horses take a chill." She set down her cup, and did not raise her voice. She had not raised it once in the whole of this history. "Your case, uncle, stripped of the flowers, is that my marriage may be made to sound uglier than it was, and that my husband will pay a great deal sooner than have his wife's own guardian carry wicked tales through every drawing-room in the county. Have I the shape of it?" Her guardian colored. "You put it very coarse, Honora. After all I have done, I put it exact, uncle." "Which you have always mistaken for coarseness, because you have never once had to look plainly at what you were doing while you did it. That was ever my share of the work. Now attend." Mr. Sedgeley, the Duke's dry solicitor, who had been sitting unregarded in the window with a locked box at his feet, for Honora had written to him the day Craik's letter came, rose and inclined his head. "The first papers, if you please." Mr. Sedgeley laid them out, dry as a law-calf's binding. "Her Grace's settlement, executed a 12-month since, which Mr. Craik will recall he did not trouble to read, being much occupied in counting it. 3 provisions, all required by Her Grace herself, before she would sign. The first discharged in full the debt upon the Wren estate, and took from Mr. Craik under his own hand a complete release, that no claim of any kind soever shall ever lie against his Grace or Her Grace by reason of that debt or this marriage. There is nothing owing here, and nothing to reopen. The second settled Miss Prudence Wren's portion and old Margaret Dow's keep to their sole separate use, beyond the reach, the words are here, and exact, of any creditor of Mr. Silas Craik, living or to come, so there is no family purse to be swelled. And the third, at Her Grace's particular instance, assigned over to Her Grace herself the whole of Mr. Craik's own outstanding notes then known, quietly bought in this 12-month past by His Grace's agents as they came to light, against precisely such an afternoon as this. In plain speech, sir, there is no annuity to be had, and no scandal worth the buying off, for Her Grace holds, at this moment, in that box, the whole of your paper, and could, if she chose, call it in tomorrow and see you in a debtor's gaol for the remainder of your natural span. Her Grace saw to it a year ago, while you told her she need not trouble her plain head to read it. The great hall was very quiet, but for the small settling of the fire. Mr. Dabney's smile did not so much fall as quietly cease to be renewed. Craik looked from the papers to his plain niece with the beginning of real fear, and then reached, at the last, for the one coin he thought still in his purse. You would never use those against your own guardian, Honora. You were always soft as butter under all your quiet. There is more in this world than paper. There is what a wronged family may feel driven to say, out of pure grief at being so cast off, about a man with a face like, ah, there it is. The tales. Honora rose, unhurried, crossed to the box, and took from it a flat-sealed packet, corded, a good 20 pages thick, and laid it on the tea-table between them, and rested her hand flat upon it, and did not open it. I wondered when we should come to the tales, uncle, for it is the only coin left you now the debt is spent. So let me show you the last paper. I will not read these to you. I will only tell you what they are. I set myself, some months since, to learn the whole truth of the old business at Sotherton. These are sworn statements, taken and witnessed by Mr. Sedgeley, the surgeon who dressed my husband's face at dawn, and had from the seconds the true cause of the quarrel, my husband's own second, living yet and glad at last to tell it. And, Above all, the sworn account of a most respectable married gentlewoman, now settled far from here under a good man's name, who was, 14 years ago, a poor companion cornered in a passage by a great man whom nobody dared cross, save one, who put himself between them, and saw her safe, and took a cut across the face at dawn sooner than name her. And never once in 14 years let his own good name be cleared at the cost of hers. Every word is here, sworn and sealed, and would clear my husband to the whole of England in a single week, and lay the true guilt at the Vane's door, and shame that proud family past any bearing. She let it sit a moment in the quiet hall. So here is your choice, uncle, and it is the last kindness of mine you will ever be offered. My husband would keep this packet sealed to the end of his days, for it is his whole nature to guard even the guilty, and go the poorer for it, and he would do it for the Vanes themselves sooner than shame them, though they wronged him worse than any soul alive. But I am not so good as my husband, and I have learned this year what his kind of goodness costs and whom it serves. Carry one word of my marriage or my husband or this house into any drawing-room in the kingdom, and this packet ceases to be sealed the same hour. The county that whispered 14 years about the Beast of Harwood learns instead the true tale of the honest man they slandered, and the proud family that lied, and while it is about it, Mr. Craik, it will learn a great deal. From your own assigned notes in that box, about the loving guardian who sold his orphaned niece twice over, and spent a gone man's estate and a young girl's portion, and every door in the county shuts to you forever. Or you go home this afternoon, and are quiet, and leave this family in its peace, and the packet stays sealed and in the dark, and every name in this room, your own and the Vanes' included, stays exactly as whole as it is this minute, which is a mercy none of you have done one thing to earn, and are getting only because I would sooner finish my husband's sort of goodness on my own terms than watch it go on quietly eating him alive. You have until the tea is cold to choose, and I find I no longer greatly mind which you decide, which is the very freest I have felt in the whole of my life. Silas Craik looked at his plain niece across the tea-table, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in all the years he had spent reckoning her too dull to be worth the looking, and what looked steadily back was not for sale, had never been for sale, had a year before been quietly reading the whole of the future, and closing every door in it against exactly this afternoon. He looked at the sealed packet under her quiet hand. He looked, last and longest, at the tall, marked, silent man by the hearth, who had gone bleeding into a runaway to save two women who were nothing to him, and something moved in the smooth, heavy face, some old, buried thing, which was, for one unguarded moment, very like shame. "Come, Mr. Dabney," he said, rising too quickly, not meeting any eye. "Put up your portfolio. There is nothing for us here." And the two went out through the warm, bright hall, and down the great steps to the chaise, without the annuity, and without 1 shilling of the ducal gold they had come so far to squeeze, and the whole grasping business ended, as Honora had meant it, not in a scandal, but in a silence, the sealed packet going back into the box unopened, into the dark, where it would stay. It was only at the great door that her guardian turned back once, and said, "Lo," and for the only time without performance, "You always did see what the rest of us couldn't be troubled to look at, Honora. Your father was the same. We thought it a dullness in you both. It was never that you couldn't see anything better. It was that you saw everything, and said nothing, and waited." "No," said Honora, not unkindly. "It was never a dullness. Go home, uncle, and be quiet, and you will keep your name, which is a great deal more than you came up this hill meaning to leave me with." And the chaise rolled, and only then, in all that grey afternoon, did the Duke of Harwood speak, from the door of his own house, in the low, rough carrying voice that had once brought 2 bolting horses round in a crowded street. "Craik." Her guardian's face came once more to the chaise window, You sold her to a man you believed a beast, to cover yourself. And she has spent this afternoon guarding your neck from the rope your own hand knotted. So I will say the thanks she is too clear-eyed to say, and you too small to understand. I am obliged to you, Mr. Craik, for the one wholly good thing you ever did, and did by pure accident, to save your own skin. You sent me my wife. Now go down my hill, and do not come up it again. Good day to you. And the chaise went, and Honora felt her husband come to her shoulder, his bare old scarred hand coming to rest, unhidden and unashamed, over hers upon the cold stone. And what she felt was neither triumph nor grief, but the plain, clean quiet of a long, hard sum at last, worked through and proved and ruled off, and under it, rising slow and warm and enormous, the whole rest of her looked at. Unhidden life. She had written, some while before Craik's coming, to the gentlewoman from whom the last and truest of the sworn statements had come. Mrs. Tilney she was now, married these 10 years to a good Kentish clergyman, telling her, one plain woman to another, who her defender at Sotherton had been, and what the guarding of her name had cost him since. Mrs. Tilney, who had spent all that while not knowing whom to thank, wrote back in a hand blotted with weeping, and asked one thing only, to come, once, and thank him. She came in the spring, and stood before the tall marked man in the light of his own gallery, and could at first say nothing, and then only, "You were the one man in that passage who was not afraid, sir. I have thought of it every day of my life since, and never knew your face to thank it, and here it is, and I find it the kindest face I ever saw." And the Duke of Harwood, who had believed for 14 years that the one wholly good act of his life had bought nothing but his own ruin, looked at the settled, safe, grateful woman that his ruin had bought. A whole blameless span of years gone quietly right, because one man in one passage had not been afraid, and could not speak, and Honora, watching from the gallery's end, saw the last of the old lie go quietly out of her husband's face. They finished the other picture together that same spring, her father's last, the half-made likeness of the mother Honora scarcely remembered. And between her father's beginning and her own hand, the ghosted face came up at last out of the ground, warm and true, the mother finished by the daughter in the house of the man who had kept the father's masterwork honored in the dark, and they hung her in the gallery near the two dukes, so that the reopened gallery of Harwood became the one house in the county where the whole truth of a face was let up into the light and kept. He wore the little chalk study still, but did not take it out any longer in the silences, for he no longer needed the last cold proof that he had once been looked at kindly. He was looked at kindly now, every hour of every day, by the one hand that had never wished his face other than it was. He set the case by at last, on the gallery shelf beneath the portraits, open, and there it stayed. The county came round, in the end, as the county always comes round, a good 10 years behind its own market women. The ugly tales of the Beast of Harwood wore thin, and then wore out, the way even the oldest and best-loved lie, will once a true thing, has been let stand beside it in the light long enough. And the tale told in the vale instead was of the great shut-house where a sorrowing lord had turned his own face and his own portrait to the wall, for a grief no one rightly remembered, until a plain, quiet duchess, who was secretly the finest taker of faces in the county, came up the hill and turned him back to the light. The county had said the Duke of Harwood could not bear to be looked at, and now, at Harwood, he was looked at plainly every hour of every day, and did not turn his face away. The great portrait Honora made of him, the marked man, the true one, in the true north light, hung at the honored end of the reopened gallery to the end of both their long contented lives, beside the warm laughing boy her own father had made, in the last good summer of his youth, and it was held by all who came at last to see it, and the county came in its slow hundreds, to be the finest likeness ever taken in the north, made by the one hand that had loved the whole of its subject, and wished not a line of him away. and there was not a soul in that once shut house but came to hold, a decade too late, what the county came round to holding, that the plain Wren girl they had sold to be rid of a debt had made the great marriage of her generation. The county had said the Duke of Harwood could not bear to be seen, and now at Harwood, to the very last of his days, the marked lord was looked at plainly and kindly and whole by the wife who had made his truest likeness, and he turned his face up to the light of it, and did not turn away, and was not ever again left. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if it moved you, consider subscribing softly so you won't miss the next one.